Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Luna Goldberg, and I'm the Education Manager at the Jewish Museum of Florida-FIU. Today's program is part of an ongoing series called Keys to the Collection. Every week, one of our museum docents will guide us in taking a closer look at a narrative, character, or object in our museum collection. Joining me today is Elaine Litvak, who's been volunteering at the museum for many years, and she is going to lead us in a presentation around the Marcus Weinkle Traveler's Torah at the museum. Before we get started, I'd like to offer a few notes to ensure that our program runs smoothly. While we encourage your participation, please make sure that your microphone is muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. And following the presentation, we'll open up the conversation to questions and comments. Lastly, I'd like to share with you a little context about the museum. The Jewish Museum of Florida-FIU is a historic and cultural institution affiliated with Florida International University. This year, we're celebrating our 25th anniversary as a museum, though our buildings precede us, having been built in the 1930s. Through our core and traveling exhibitions, our museum is dedicated to telling the story of more than 250 years of Florida Jewish history, arts, and culture. While our doors are currently closed, we invite you to visit our website to learn more about our virtual programs, lectures, and exhibitions. And without further ado, please welcome Elaine Litvak.
Hi, everybody. Luna said that I should probably begin a little bit telling you about my background and why I became I went to high school in Rochester, New York, and I went to SUNY at Buffalo, and I majored in history and I minored in education. And in Buffalo, while my husband was in school, I taught American history. Finished for school and the military and everything, we moved to Plantation, Florida. So we were in Plantation for about 35 years, and we were very involved with Temple Columbia, which is now Temple Columbia Emmanuel. And before I knew it, I was teaching Jewish American history to the 6th graders and Jewish history to the 7th graders and comparative religions and all about the shtetl and a bunch of things. So that's really where I got a lot of my background. We moved down here in 2005, about 2 blocks from the Jewish Museum, and I immediately went over there, and I was just blown away with the beauty of the building and the material of the permanent exhibit. I just had a wonderful time. I was finally, Broward County just didn't have much history. It wasn't too interesting to me. But I just became totally thrilled with what I was seeing on the walls and the history that was going on here in Miami and Miami Beach. And I immediately asked if I could docent. And I trained as a docent, and probably around 2006 or 7, I'm not exactly sure, I started, and I've totally enjoyed it, like all docents. The people that are working in the museum, we love to be in the museum, and best of all, the people that come in that we meet that are so diverse and varied, and we just have a wonderful time being docents. I've been much more enriched for being associated with the museum. So now I'm going to talk to you today about Marcus Weinkle. Absolutely my favorite exhibit in the whole museum. Everybody likes it for many, many different Marcus, and I think he's cute guy. Anyways, his original name was Marcus Joseph Winkle. Later, how the name got changed. It wasn't at Castle Garden. It was for another reason, which I thought was very interesting. He was born in Russia, in that area, Grodno, in the Palace Element, in 1866. And his parents were pretty well off. They owned land. I think they may have owned. Wasn't too bad for them, except that in 1881, the pogroms that went throughout Russia and were so horrible. Within a few hours, they destroyed everything that the Winkowski family had, but they stayed, and I'm sure they recouped a little. things were going along well, I guess, for Marcus. He was growing up, and about age 21, he was, and we know what that meant. That meant that you were the first person out in the battlefield. You couldn't keep kosher. If you were lucky to live through the experience, you probably wouldn't even know where your home was anymore. It was what drove so many millions of my grandfather, included one of my grandparents. And that was one of the reasons why they left Russia, to not have to be part of that. So what they did said that Marcus had died of a fever. And that was very common around that time, that people got fevers and they died. Authorities, they told the neighbors, and they actually had, and this is what's so fascinating, and kids just love this story, they actually buried him alive. He probably used some type of tube, I'm not sure, maybe that was in his journals, which unfortunately I haven't read, but after they had the ceremony and the family went back to sit Shiva, which they obviously did, for 7 days. He was dug out. I'm sure he probably had some help. But the bottom line is they did leave him some clothing, some money, and a Torah. So at this point, Luna, these are actually pants. I cannot believe he saved these. But these were handmade pants, and they were worn by by Marcus Weinkle as he traveled. And boy, did he travel with his Torah, with some money. It took him a few years. He had to steal over the border to Germany. He had to go through Austria. He got to Egypt, and he finally got to Israel, which at that time was Palestine. He felt that this is where the Jews originated. This is where he could make a home for himself. He went originally to Jaffa, and that picture that you saw in the beginning, that was the picture that was sent home, I'm sure, very carefully to his family when he finally got to Israel, to let them know that he was alive. And as I think I said before, if you look at the bottom, you can see that Jaffa's printed on it. But what he did, his parents sent money to a bank in Jaffa, and he got, I don't know if he used all of it, but he went to Rishon LeZion, which is a big town now in Israel. But at that time, it was a there because it was founded in 1882 by Russians. So he probably felt this, they'd be speaking Russian, this would be a good place for him. And he purchased sheep, and I'm assuming he planned to create a huge herd, become a sheep farmer, and start to do very well. Well, unfortunately, most of his sheep were stolen. The Ottoman Turks were not delightful to live under. Their banks were having problems, and he was discouraged, and Marcus decided that he was going to go home again. And he traveled home. It probably took him another year or so to get that far. And he stole into his village, went into his house, probably scared his parents to death. There was no way to say, I'm coming. And while he was there, a seamstress happened to come by and almost fainted because she saw him, and I guess she ran away, but she was at his funeral. And Marcus said, I have to leave immediately. You people, we all have to go to the United States of America. America's where Jews, will be free of persecution. And he took off, stole through his village, which wasn't so easy, got himself over to Germany, and he did get onto a ship. It was, I have the name, it was the Augusta Victoria. And on the ship, he heard about Florida. He didn't get there right away, but he did hear about Florida, and he had some about it. He came into Castle Garden, so he is listed in that area in Castle Garden, and he still kept his name. He was still Marcus Weinkle, and he had to start off as best he could by peddling in New York. And while he was in New York, there was another Weinkle that he heard of, but he heard that he had bad credit, and he had a bad name. And at this point, he said, And I can tell this is a very fine man. He didn't want anybody to associate himself with bad credit or anything like that. And so this is when he chose the name Weinkle. Now, Weinkle is a Dutch name, and he was a bright guy, and he probably knew a lot of history. And he knew that the Dutch were always very good to the Jews. They were a real safeguard for many Jewish people. At any rate, so he chose the name Weinkle, which was Dutch, but what he did was he inserted an E in it because he wanted the people to know that we're coming to America, because he was expecting other family members to eventually make the trek over, and they could identify that this was definitely it. And so from that point on, he started to be known as from peddling in New York, he got himself to, I'm looking at my notes, he got himself to South Carolina, and he opened a store there. I do believe there was probably some money that was helping him out when he first got there to get him started. Then finally, in 1902, he makes it to Florida. And I still remember hearing that he went to Moffett, Florida. And I took out a map, and it took me about 10 or 15 minutes. It's a little teeny town. It's south of Jacksonville, but it is on the map. And what he did is he bought about 40,000 acres, I believe, for about 40 cents an acre, and it was filled with pine trees, and he became he started a lumber mill. And he started obviously to do very well because he wanted to get married. And he wanted a good Jewish Orthodox wife. And he went up to New York and he found one. And it must have been a beautiful marriage. They were both, I think, on the same page with religion and everything. Her name was Hannah Rose Radikowski. They got married in 1904. And here's a picture of her. I don't know if you can see the rest of it, but there's a child on each side. They had Charlotte in 1905, and then they had Moses, and Moses was in 1907. Well, he was very successful at the lumber mill, but the story goes, from what I'm told, his wife stepped on a nail one day, and those were the days when you didn't have tetanus shots. And I guess it was believed that if you wrapped some meat around a puncture wound like that, it would help to draw out the poison. And I guess it was a piece of pork, something obviously that was trafe. And the farm people that did it to her, that were working on at the lumber mill, of course they did this in all kindness and concern, but she was absolutely overwhelmed by the fact that she had something that was not kosher touching her body. And it wasn't long thereafter that the family decided to move up to Jacksonville, Florida. Now, from what I understand, most of the trees were pretty well cut down, but he sold this land now for about $1 an acre. And this is 40,000 acres, and and from that point on, I guess he got involved more with investments and things of that sort. But you know, what a special person. He never forgot who he was, where he came from, because he founded in Jacksonville the Immigrant Aid Society of Jacksonville. And his wife, she was the head of Hadassah. They were leading community members. I got on the internet and I found written about famous Jacksonville people, Jewish people, and they wrote a beautiful article about him. And he was just a stellar person of the community, very involved, of course, in his temple. I understand his parents did get over there. His father, this is kind of a really sad story. His father also bought a lumber mill in Georgia, but it was demolished and destroyed by the KKK. The sky. But at any rate, so they had a long, good life in Jacksonville. He did die. I'm not sure when his wife did, but he died around 1933, and that's when the family moved away. to different areas. And there are Weinkles all over the Florida. And for those of you who are watching, we have a very famous Weinkle. James is here today to give us some information. I do believe his brother, Marcus's brother, Carl, he is the one that came down to Florida, and in 1925, he opened the very first food market in Miami. Later, I think there were 19 of them, and he eventually sold out to Pantry Pride. And after that, he got very involved, I believe, in the banking industry. Picture of him, he was involved with Mount Sinai, as were so many of the Jewish. These people were on the board of trustees. You would probably know all their names. I'm glad to see there's a woman in one of the pictures. But Carl is standing fourth from the left. And I'm pretty sure that I picked out the right one. But he was on the board. His wife, Esther, Carl's wife, Esther, was very special. She actually was a recipient of an Eleanor Roosevelt Israel Humanitarian Award in 1963. Eleanor Roosevelt, unfortunately, had passed, but her children came, and it's actually a beautiful medal that I saw in Marcia Zarowitz's book. There's another picture I'd like to show you, just how they were so much a part of the community. Could you show the two little kids? The slide of that's Stanley and Milton Weinkle, and that's in 1931. It was the thing to do. Everybody had they took all these pictures. If you go to the Jewish Museum, you'll see pictures of people on alligators. It's really, really very cute. Now could you go back to look at this Torah? I wanted to say a few more things about it. Okay, so this is the Torah that is sometimes not in the Jewish Museum. It's still used by the Weinkle family. They must obviously be very close family. But this is amazing. Marcia Zarowitz, who was the founder, the person who kicked off all the information we got off of Florida, and she helped to start the Mosaic, which was the traveling exhibit. Marcia spent a few years traveling all over Florida, searching for objects and learning the stories so that she could create this whole book, of the Jews in Florida. 63. The Spanish left with the Treaty of Paris, and the first 3 Jews came over, and they came to the area then known as West Florida, but it's Pensacola area. Anyway, she had heard about this Torah, and she did hear, I don't know if you can tell the way my screen is, but she heard that there was a family, it's called a traveling Torah, that Marcus Weinkle took him all over his travels, and finally was in Jacksonville in a synagogue, and she did know that there was a broken filial, and that was the clue, and she found it. And she talked them into the temple. I do not know which temple it is, but she talked them into letting them use it for the exhibit. And then, of course, when finally the museum, how fortunate when our museum was created, they allow it to be a major part of our exhibition. And it's truly, absolutely, absolutely special. Before we go back to talk about all the Weinkles and hopefully hear from other people who are one of which is a Weinkle, and people that know them, I just wanted to show you one slide that is something that I have in my possession. Do you have that one, Luna? It doesn't look as good as it does in person, but you can see it's from 1899. This was something that was brought over from Russia, from my husband's grandmother. I'm not sure if she made it. I think her mother may have made it. It might have been a parting gift. But it's a Matzo Cloth. You've probably seen them before. It has 3, you open it up and there's places for the 3 Matzo Cloths, but the 3 pieces of matzah. But this is just such a cherished part of our family. It's amazing how tangible things I just feel a relationship with my roots. And it's funny, we recently, of course, had a hurricane that almost came our way. It came very fortunately, it was not much of a hurricane. But I remember thinking, well, if I had to leave because we have a bad hurricane, you think about all the things you bring with you. This is probably one of the first things I would get. This is so much part and parcel of my family, and I know that's how the Weinkle family feels about that Torah, and I'm just so delighted that they're sharing with it and allowing us to use it. So that's about it. If anybody would like to add or ask some questions.
Thank you, Elaine. That was wonderful. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, James, we would love to hear from you as well.
Well, thank you. First of all, Elaine, thank you so much. That was really a nice take on things. There were a couple of little things. As I read Marcus's journal, it seems to me that he traveled first, then came back. He was conscripted into the Tsar's army at that point.
Oh.
And it appears to me that that's when they faked his death. The legend of the burial is a great one. You know, whether that really happened or he was hiding under the house, he was definitely secreted. And his father's name, who was my great grandfather, his name was Yehuda Hirsch Venikovsky, and he and his wife Nechakma did make it to the United States and did immigrate here and became citizens. And his name, he became Jerome, the first Jerome Hirsch Weinkle. There was later a Jerome new, who was a grandson of Yehuda Hirsch. But Yehuda Hirsch had 5 children. Marcus was one, and Marcus's actual name was Mordecai. And then he Americanized it and became Marcus or Max. At times he was known as Max. You talked a bit about the father. It appears from what I remember from my aunt, my grandfather's sister, whose name was Lena Winkle Chaikin. But Aunt Lena told me that they were in the timber business back in the old country. So the fact that Marcus went into the timber business in the States, first in South Carolina, and he might have been in Georgia, I'm not sure about that. They were definitely in the Savannah and Brunswick, a little bit west of Brunswick area, before coming to Florida. And they were in Moffett and another town. But it's pretty fascinating. And my great-grandfather, Yehuda Hirsch, actually became quite prosperous himself. I have found, and it may have been what you were referring to, but I found an article where he sold 50,000 acres of timberland in 50,000 acres, if you can imagine. Wow. In the county where St. Augustine is, I forget the name of that county. And so they all were just incredibly hardworking people. Right. The legend I always heard, and I heard it from my grandfather, who was Carl. Carl's father was Marcus's brother, and Carl's father's name was Louis. But what my grandfather had told me was that they were in an area, they called it Winkle, Georgia, and it doesn't exist today. It was probably a railroad stop. I know from a recording I have now where it is, and it's somewhere west of Brunswick, Georgia. But they had a timber mill there. And they were probably burned out by the Klan, and the Lewis Winkle family at that point, including my grandfather, go to Atlanta. My great-grandfather opens up a little market. My grandfather, who's the youngest boy or second youngest boy, is pulled out of school at 8th grade to go work in the little grocery store, so the older ones could go to college. and a number of them went to Emory and other schools. But my grandfather meets eventually Esther, who's living in Savannah. They marry, and when my great-grandfather Louis, and this is how the Weinkles come to Miami, but my great-grandfather Louis had asthma, and the doctor said, go to Miami. So Carl and Esther moved down here in Lemon City, which is now Little Haiti.
Right.
And they open up a little market, and Louis and Rosa come down, and they're all living above the little market. And that is the beginning of Carl's Markets, which become Weinkle's Markets, and also the beginning of Weinkle's Liquors, which becomes a prominent business down here. But that's a little bit about my family. I don't want to talk too much, but thank you for the story. It's really, we most recently used the Torah at my niece Naya's bat mitzvah in South Carolina a year ago, January, and it was just on display because she's conservative and it's not kosher, that particular Torah, but it was very memorable and meaningful to the family, and it still is.
Wow. Do you ever have family reunions?
Yes, so that's a great question. So we were supposed to have one last week at the end of July. We were meeting in north part of North Carolina now, and it started actually my oldest brother and a cousin of mine who happens to be Stanley's son, who you showed a picture of Stanley as a little boy. But we started these family reunions a number of years ago, and now they've grown, and we do them in North Carolina. So it was canceled last week because of COVID, but it's been rescheduled for next year. But this year we had actually expanded out, because as I've been doing research and putting together this big family tree, I've linked in with Marcus's his grandson, who is Abraham's son, and as well as his name is Joseph Weinkle, and I've linked in with Joseph's son, who is Jonathan, who's a doctor in Pittsburgh, and recently wrote a nice book on Judaism and healing. But anyway, so I'm in touch with that whole line of the family now, and as well as Abraham's other son, David, who lives in California. And we have Zoom meetings.
My gosh.
We did last week, I had hosted 2 Zoom meetings of the Weinkles that we could link in. So it was pretty cool.
How many people do you get when you have these meetings?
So the Zoom meetings, the first one we did, we had about 30. The attendance of the last one wasn't very good, but the reunion, when we did that 2 years ago, I think there were 40 or 50 people or more who came. And we picked North Carolina because it's kind of a central place for people now. And so
excellent.
It's a lot of fun.
Sarah, did you have a question?
Well, I have a comment. I went to James's Uncle Jerry's second bar mitzvah. I forgot what year it was. Do you remember, James? Oh, you're muted. What year was it?
Can't remember, but at his bar mitzvah.
That's why I mentioned it. Yeah, that was so fascinating. And he told the whole story of the history. So I knew about it before I saw it at the Jewish Museum. It was like amazing.
Wow.
And also, when I was a little girl, I grew up in the Shenandoah area of the city of Miami. So we used to go to Carl's Market when I was very young. It was on 22nd Avenue, Coral Way, Southwest. And then it became the Park Lane Cafeteria, which the family still owned, right? Right, James? Oh, you're muted.
That was owned by my Uncle Melvin, and but that wasn't, I don't remember that being the same location. But
it was. We went there many times.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and my mother even worked there for a while.
And Ava, I don't know anything about the Weinkle wine. You'll have to let me know. What is that wine?
Was it in the liquor store?
No, Eva,
I know what she wrote, but I mean, did they sell it in the liquor store?
never heard of it.
Oh, okay. It's a coincidence.
Huh.
Ava, can you go off mute and ask that question about the wine or what you know about it? Eva?
Eva, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Yes, hi everybody. You know, it was a lot of questions while I was working over there from people, because they told me they saw this wine with the label Weinkle, family Weinkle. It says Weinkle wine. And people ask me any connection with the Torah, that with this family who owns the Torah. So I just wanted to know exactly, you know, just for future.
And where did you see the wine?
People told me.
Oh, okay.
People told me they saw this wine, and even I think they mentioned something about St. Augustine winery.
So I can tell you, I've personally never heard of it, but I can tell you for sure, and this goes back to the story of Marcus creating the Weinkle name. He created this spelling, and it's in his journal, so that anyone with this name knew that they were related. And so if there was a Weinkle wine with this name, it had to have been from someone, some relative, but I've never heard of it. But thank you, that's interesting.
James,
I'm sorry,
this is Nancy Cohen. I'm the museum manager. Just to clarify, Eva ran the gift shop and the store for 20 years at the museum, and she was obviously, those are comments of people that came in over the last 20 years that saw the tour. That's why she was bringing that comment up. I don't know if you've ever met Eva, but she's a very valued employee of the museum for many years.
That's
Oh, wonderful.
I have another comment. In 1996, I took Paul George's history class on the history of South Florida and Miami, and we had to write a paper about some aspect. So I did it about the early history of the Jewish people. And I think I interviewed Jerry, your uncle, about your family. And also I interviewed somebody else who catered the wedding in 1920s of who got married in your family in the 20s in Miami. It was one of the major weddings of the year. Anyway, it was like the biggest event in the Jewish community in Miami that year. And it was Sunny Hirschbein who told me that, because her parents were the caterers. And it was really cool. But the funny part, she wouldn't let me put in the paper. I think she's dead now, so I can tell you the story. She had worked, she was a little kid, and she worked with her parents all day getting this wedding together. And then at night, when they were putting everything back in their car to take it back to the catering company, there was a big tank for the gefilte fish in the back seat, and she didn't know about it. And she thought she was going to go to sleep in the back seat, and she wound up in the gefilte fish tank.
That's a good one. James, I was working at the Jewish Museum one time, or I should say volunteering there, and a Jordan Weinkle came in to see the Torah. Do you know her?
Jordan is my cousin. He's an attorney on Miami Beach, and he's a great guy.
Okay.
And,
oh, I was so excited that I met a Weinkle.
Yeah.
Anyways, what an illustrious family, and to have so much information, so unusual. So many of the people that came over from Russia, they didn't want to talk about it. They had miserable experience in Russia. They didn't talk to their kids about Russia. I was fortunate. My grandma told me all about the shtetl she lived in and how she came over on the boat. And I always have felt a real connection to this. But I think it's just amazing that Marcus thought to give this and hand this down to his children. Perhaps he realized what a remarkable life that he and his family had.
It's only like 11 or 12 or 13 pages. It's not very long, and it's single space typed. It was done really at the request, I believe, of Charlotte, because he would tell Charlotte, his daughter, and I'll link in Charlotte with the museum in a minute, but he would tell Charlotte the history, and she asked that he write it down. So he begins by noting he's been asked to write this down. And because of what he wrote down, he tells who his parents are, who his great-grandparents are, and great-grandparents, and he mentions where they are. And I've been able to, because of that, trace our family back into these areas of the territories switched between Russia and Poland, and I'm not Poland, Russia and Lithuania and Ukraine. And so it's now in Russian territory, but back then it would shift. But Charlotte is the link to the museum, because and Charlotte Weinkle Torah was living in Sarasota. Marcia was on her tour before the museum was created, when she was collecting memorabilia that became, what was it called? The Mosaic. And then that later became the museum. But Marcia was giving her dog and pony show in Sarasota, and Charlotte came up to her, and this is what Marcia tells me, and Charlotte came up and said, I have something that my family has something that may interest you, and it's in Jacksonville. And apparently it was like at the Jacksonville Community Center, which, Jewish Community Center, which I think Marcus had something to do with the founding. But yeah, the family donated it ultimately to the Jewish Museum of Florida. So
how lucky we are.
Story. It's a very cool story.
Yeah, it's great.
Fascinating. Well, thank you all so much. Do we have any final questions or comments?
Could I tell a few words?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. I just know that right now the city where this family used to live, the name is Dnieper, and now it's Ukraine. And, actually what I heard that family father was like an engineer, and he used to build the railroads over there. And family came from Germany, originally from Germany. He was invited to build a railroad in, at this time, name of the city was Yekaterinoslav, and he was invited to build a railroad over there. So I don't know if James heard about that.
So the history of what I've learned about the Jewish settlements in that area of Yekaterinoslav, and you probably have a much better pronunciation than me, is that basically Jews and I forgot what other kinds of people, Slavic people or something, the area was unsettled, it was wetlands, it was swampy lands, and they were encouraged to settle that land. And they were given like 5 hectares, however you pronounce that word, and to do it. And there was also an agreement at that point in history, which is like, I don't know, the late 1700s or something, that they would not have to be conscripted into the Tsar's armies. And
right.
And anyway, so I don't know anything about a railroad, but I do know that they came to those areas, not just my family, but other families, to settle those areas. And so those towns emerged, and I can trace our family back to those through Russian records. There were census records, and they were, somebody long ago I started doing searches on Google searches for these towns and then census records and found my relatives there. The ones that are mentioned in Marcus's journal, what we call the journal.
So it was Yekaterina Slav, right?
Yeah,
Yekaterina.
they were there, but they were also in other little towns near there.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty interesting, Eva. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you.
Elaine, if Nancy can give you my email, and I'll be happy to email you the journal and Charlotte's addition to it.
Thank you so much.
Some other information I found, but if you, the article you referred to about Marcus, if you have that and can get it back to me, that would be interesting to me.
Okay. Oh, okay. Very good. The one from Jacksonville.
Yeah, I may have it, but just in
Yeah.
case I don't.
Oh, really? Okay. I'll look for it again. But I tried to research. You know, I found all kinds of Winkles. You know, and but it was really special. This was really special that you joined this chat. You've just made it wonderful for us.
Oh, thank you all. Thank you for your interest. It makes me.
Absolutely. It's my favorite.
Fascinating. Well, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you all.
Next week, we'll be focusing on the Miami Beach's Jewish history. So join us again next week at 3 o'clock, and we'll be sending reminders, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Be safe.